So here we want to discuss what should be included in Phase 1 Environmental Site Assessment Report. This page shows it's page 8 of your handouts, shows an example of table of content that you could actually use for your Phase 1 Environmental Site Assessment. This table of content includes executive summary, introduction, scope of investigation, record reviews, interviews, site reconnaissance, review and evaluation of information, conclusion, references, and appendices. We're going to discuss all of these little details in more, all of these components in more details. A little bit more expanded version of this outline is in your page 9. As you see, the Phase 1 Environmental Site Assessment Review starts with executive summary, introduction, and all these little components. As you see, it's broken down into more details, and we are going to discuss all these details briefly here, and we'll see what you should include in your Phase 1 Environmental Site Assessment Report. In every report, of course, it's very important to have executive summary. All professional reports, it's very important to have an executive summary. In your executive summary, you are going to include the most important findings of your Phase 1 Environmental Site Assessment Report. It's of course, one of the very important things that you want to include in the executive summary is whether or not the site is contaminated and whether or not Phase 2 environmental site assessment is required. So those are the very important questions that you should answer in your executive summary. You also have an introduction. In your introduction, you are explaining the property, where it is located, why the client actually contacted you, when the contact was done, and what is the project that you're taking on. Then you go ahead and will explain first what is the scope of your site investigation. It's very important that you focus on your scope and you describe it in your report, so anyone who wants to read the report will know what you're looking for in your Phase 1 ESA. The next thing that you want to put here is the results of your record review. Here I've broken this down into more details. The first thing is the general record reviews. For example, the area determination, where the property is located. Give details of the information of the location. Then you want to discuss. You want to include also when this and how the site was developed in the beginning. If you have any fire insurance plans or maps, the chain of titles means that who actually owned the property in the past and who owns it now, or any environmental reports about the property. So any changes, any problems, any issues in the past you want to record here. The environmental source information will be the next second. Also, you want to include the physical setting sources. For example, if you have any aerial photographs, if you have topography, hydrology, geology maps, if you have any fill materials, information knowing that what kind of soil you have in the area, water bodies and areas of natural significance. For example, if there's a national park, if there's a lake, if there's an area that is specifically important environmentally, you want to record it in this section. You also want to record if there is any well in the area. Wells are especially very important because not only they could be the source of contamination themselves, they also could be a good source for taking samples from groundwater. So you may not have to, you may reduce your cost. If there is a well available, you may be able to just take samples from oil, and you will understand. You'll get a lot of information about the groundwater pollution if there is any groundwater pollution in your property. You also want to include any site operating records. If you can have access to that kind of information, that will be very also important. Knowing that what kind of operation has been going on the site, you want to also include that in your records review section. Number 5, in your phase 1 environmental site assessment report is basically the interviews that you do. You want to, when you conduct any interview, it's very important to provide the date, the place, and the method of the interview, and the name of the person that is being interviewed. This is extremely important because that could be also a legal document in the future. Because if something happens after the interview or before the interview, you want to know. You want to have the date and the place. You also want to know the method of the interview. Sometimes the interviews are by phone, sometimes it's in-person interview, sometimes you just send a questionnaire to people, so you have to record what kind of interview was done, and or maybe even the interview was done in mail. The reason why the person was identified as the interview subject is also very important. If the person was a previous owner, the current owner, or a neighbor, or someone who was affected by the environmental conditions of the property, you have to also in your report mention that relationship. So you also want to record any relevant information concerning potentially contaminating activity and area of potential environmental concern that you get from the interviewer. So it's very important to record anything that you talk about in your interview that could be related to the contaminated site. And in the end, you identify and evaluate the relevant information from the interviews concerning the potentially contaminated activity, and you want to write down that kind of evaluation in your interview section as well. The site evaluation is also very important. So site reconnaissance is very important, that you actually basically go to the site and visually evaluate the site. What you will do in your site investigation is to find out what are the general requirements. You also record specific observations that you want to find. For example, find out any evidence of activities, any evidence of underground storage tanks, or any evidence of damage. You want to record that here in this section. You need to also write the description of investigation, meaning that how you did the investigation, how long it took, what date it was, and who actually did the site investigation. So you need to actually go ahead and record all of these details in your phase 1 environmental site assessment report. Another under this site assessment, again, to break it down a little bit more, for general requirements, for example, you may want to provide notes of the following for each investigation: date and time of the investigation, weather conditions, the length and time of the investigation, whether the facility was operating at the time of the investigation, where the phase 1 property is an enhanced investigation property. So it means that you want to know if the property was actually operating right when you were actually doing the site investigation. This is also very important, may actually impact what you see on the site. The name and qualifications of the person conducting the investigation is also very important. For example, if you're sending a technician with X number of years of experience, you want to mention that in your report. That could actually validate your report in the end. You also may provide the following information analysis: photographs of the exterior and interior portions of the phase 1 property. Remember, whenever we talk about phase 1 property, we just mean the property that is being assessed through the phase 1 environmental site assessment. You document any area of potential environmental concern, and you illustrate any relevant structures and areas of disturbed soils, including fill areas, and you also prepare a written description and explanation of the photographs, including the orientation by compass of the photograph, or describe the photograph with respect to other photographs, records, and figures. So basically, you may go and take pictures and do some illustrations, do some on-site drawings, just to record whatever you can about what is happening in the property, and you record any visual damage, any visual concern, activities of concern that you possibly could see on the property. Again, remember, here we are not doing any testing or sampling. We are just simply doing observations and asking questions in our phase 1 environmental site assessment. You may also include some specific observations at phase 1 property. You may provide the following information: general description of structure and other improvements, including the number and age of buildings. You may include the general description of the number, age, and depth of below ground structures. If you can get that kind of information, it's very important. Details of all tanks above or below ground, including the material and methods of construction of tank age, tank contents, and tank volume, whether in use or not. Remember, if you see any underground or upper ground storage tank, it doesn't matter if it is in use or if it is in use still or no. It's completely idle. You have to still keep the record of that kind of tank that could be very useful for future. Also could give you a clue of whether or not a type of contamination might have happened on the property. Again, it is also very important to know if you see an in-use or idle storage tank. It's very important to know what was the use of the tank. If it was filled by water, by oil, or by fuel, you have to also record that. Any potable or non-potable water sources should be recorded in your phase 1 environmental site assessment report. It means that if you have any lake, well, river, streams, you should actually include all of that in your report. You also will try to provide the type and approximate location of underground utility and service corridors, such as sewer, water, electrical, or gas lines located on, in, or under the phase 1 property. This is very, very important, especially if you want to do sampling analysis in your phase 2 environmental site assessment. You want to understand what kind of barriers you have. You also want to understand where are the lines of water and sewer and electricity, so you don't damage them. Also, it is sometimes possible that, for example, sewer lines themselves could be the potential source of pollution for groundwater and for soil. You also identify and document the following features of the structure and buildings at the phase 1 property. This is very important. Exit and entry points, details of existing and former heating systems, including type and fuel source, because the fuel source could be also the source for the contamination. Details of cooling systems. Cooling systems, most of them might use different types of fuel. They could also be the source of contamination. Details of any drains, pits, and sumps, including their current use, if any, and former use. That's also important, because the drains, sometimes the pollution could actually go to the drains, and you want to find out if that has been happening. Details of any unidentified substances, and details including location of stains or corrosion on floors other than from water, where located near a drain, pit, sump, crack, or other potential discharge locations. That's also very important, because that will give you a clue of understanding whether or not any contamination has been happening on the land. So this is again another part that sort of details that you should include whenever you do site visits and site investigation. You also may have to provide the documentations on details including location of current and former wells, including all wells described or defined in or under the, well, we say Ontario. This is not for Ontario. It could be for Manitoba or Ontario Water Resources Act or Manitoba Environmental Act and the Oil, Gas and Salt Resources Act. Details of sewage works, including their location. This is also very important. If you have any type of sewer line, if you have septic tanks, septic fields in the area, you have to record that in your reports. And of course, you want to have the details of ground surface, including types of ground cover such as grass, gravel, soil, or pavement. That will help you to understand for your next steps if you want to do phase 2 environmental site assessment, or if you want to take on any remediation action. That will help you in those steps. You also want to record the details of current or former railway lines or spurs and their locations. Of course, this will be also important, that you don't want to, because sometimes those lines could be also a source of pollution themselves. Again, if you have access, you should be able to provide the documentation of the following: the areas of stained soil, vegetation, or pavement, because the stained soil, vegetation, or pavement could be the indication of existence of some sort of pollution. Any stressed vegetation, for example, if you see that the vegetation is a little bit different in some areas, that could be also indicator of some sort of contamination in the area. Also, areas where fill and debris materials appear to have been placed or graded, that's also important, because then it means that maybe the soil could actually came from somewhere else, or excavation could have happened. Potentially contaminating activities in the area. If you see any activities in the past or current that could have happened in the area, you should record that. Details of any unidentified substances found on the property. That also should be corrected, because any unidentified substance could be also a clue for contamination. You also if you go to the site visit, you may perform enhanced investigation. You may want to look for the operations at the property, including processing or manufacturing, hazardous materials used or stored in the property, products manufactured, byproducts and wastes, raw materials handling and storage locations, whether in use or not, details of drums, totes, and bins. These drums, totes, and bins could be used for storing hazardous materials, sometimes sewage, or sometimes oil and gas, so you should be very careful about that. Details of any all oil and water separators, including for each separator the location, installation date, source of incoming liquid, and effluent discharge location. So you basically record all that details. You should go on next page 19. You see all other details. For example, in all vehicles and equipment maintenance areas, including the locations of maintenance, fluid storage, and waste storage areas, whether in use or not. These are also important. Why? Because wherever you have vehicle maintenance, it means that you may have oil and gas discharge, you may have some sort of contamination. Details of all spills, including the dates, location, materials involved, and volume of materials spilled. Of course, this information you are relying on the owner or client. You have to ask questions whether or not that kind of spills happened, or you may look for evidence of that kind of spill on your area. Details of liquid discharge points such as water and French drains, including their locations. Details of operations at the property, including processing or manufacturing and equipment used in processing and manufacturing. Details of all hydraulic lift equipment at the property, including elevators, in-ground hoists, or loading docks. Why? Because any of these equipments are used for vehicle maintenance or equipment maintenance. So it's very important to know where they're located, how they're calibrated, where they were in use, and what kind of use they were in. That will help you to understand if contamination has happened in the past or not. If you flip to the other page, page 20 of your handout, you'll see eventually in your site visit, you also provide the written description of the investigations carried out, including the details of each of the investigations and any findings that are relevant to the existence of an area of potential contaminant, environmental concerns, such as the presence on, in, or under the phase 1 property of any of the things which may be relevant to the existence of an area of potential environmental concern. So basically you write down anything that could potentially be concerning, and that potentially could be a concern for environmental, for your soil pollution. So you write all of that information in your phase 1 environmental site assessment report. Number 7 in your outline for your phase 1 environmental site assessment report is the review and evaluation of information. This is, of course, the part and the core part of your environmental site assessment report, because here you basically go on and look at all the information that you've gathered, and based on that you try to evaluate the information. So there are 4 different subsections here that are included, and we're going to look at these subsections in more details. The current and past uses, potentially contaminating activities, areas of potential environmental concern, and phase 1 conceptual site model. We are going to go and look at each of these subsections. The first one is the current and past uses. So in this section you provide a table of current and past uses of the phase 1 property in the form approved by the director. So you list all the past and present basically activities inside. You provide a description of the current and past uses of the phase 1 property to its first developed use. So you basically list all the activities. Number 2 is potentially contaminating activities. This is very important. So you provide a list and description of each potentially contaminating activity on the property, and provide a list and description of each potentially contaminating activity in the phase 1 study area that may be contributing to an area of potential environmental concern. So here, as you will see in the next videos or next lectures, we will discuss the phase 2 environmental site assessment. We will discuss what kind of activities could be considered risky or could be considered potentially contaminating activities. If you see any of those activities, you're going to list this in this area. As I said, we are going to discuss those activities in more details in the future. Number 3, the subsection 3 of your review and evaluation of information is discussing the areas of potential environmental concern. So you provide a table of areas of potential environmental concern in a form approved by the director. Provide documentation and rationale for the conclusion referred to the existence of areas of potential concerns, including a discussion of the logic and reasoning used by the qualified person to evaluate the available information, a summary and description of any area of potential environmental concern determined to exist, a summary, description, and rationale for contaminants of potential concern identified with respect to each area of potential concern determined to exist, and finally a discussion and description of how any uncertainty or absence of information obtained in each of the components of the Phase 1 environmental site assessment could affect the conclusion. These are the main important things that you're looking for. Number 4, Phase 1 environmental conceptual site model, or CSM. We sometimes call it CSM, the Phase 1 conceptual site model. What we do here is basically sort of a conclusion. We provide one or more figures of the Phase 1 study area that show any existing buildings and structure, identifies and locates water bodies located in whole or in part on the Phase 1. So basically you draw an illustration. Identify and locate any areas of natural significance, for example, national parks, lakes, rivers. Locate any drinking water wells in the property. Show roads, including names within the Phase 1 study area. Show uses of properties adjacent to the Phase 1 property. The reason is sometimes the adjacent or neighboring properties could be the source of contamination that we don't know. So we have to show them and show the use of those properties on our map or drawing. Identify and locate areas where any potentially contaminating activity has occurred and show tanks in such areas. And also identify and locate any areas of potential environmental concerns. You also want to provide a description as an assessment of any area where potentially contaminating activity on or potentially affecting the Phase 1 property has occurred. Any contaminants of potential concern, the potential for underground utilities if any present to affect contaminant distribution and transport. For example, you may have drinking water lines or sewer lines underground, so cross-contamination could happen. So you also have to record that in your initial drawings. Also, you may have any available regional or site-specific geological or hydrological information. So if you have anything like that, you should include that in your report. And you also have to include how any uncertainty or absence of information obtained in each of the components of the Phase 1 environmental site assessment could affect the validity of the model. So basically you're recording any risk that could be associated with your gathered information. Eventually, after you've done all of these steps in your environmental Phase 1 environmental site assessment, what you will do, you will actually go ahead and perform conclusions. So in your conclusions, you're clearly answering the questions that we just discussed in the Phase 1 environmental site assessment objectives. If you remember, the objectives were whether or not the contamination is happening or whether or not we need to do Phase 2. Those are the very important questions to answer. So in your conclusion, you specifically state whether Phase 2 environmental site assessment is required before record of site conditions submitted. So we actually sometimes we call the record of site condition, we call it RSC. We want to know if Phase 2 is needed or not. Then we record of site condition based on Phase 1 will be prepared, and then we will actually have the signatures, whoever has done the Phase 1 environmental site assessment. Of course, we have to include references and appendices. Appendices could be pictures or drawings. References could be, or in appendices we may even include and attach environmental regulations and acts, federal, provincial, or municipal acts. In references, we might include any report in the past, any environmental site assessments that have happened in the past, or any other records that we may have referred to in our report. So that will conclude our Phase 1 environmental site assessment report. Just going back to it, as you see, this is the table of content. Page 26 concludes what should be included in phase 1 environmental site assessment report: executive summary, introduction, scope of investigation, record review, interviews, and so on. So this, as I said, this is the phase 1 environmental site assessment. In the next lecture, we will discuss whether or not we need to do phase 2 environmental site assessment, and if we need to do phase 2 environmental site assessment, how we should do it, and what should be recorded and included in phase 2 environmental site assessment.